The night was dense with humidity, the kind of jungle air that clung to the skin and refused to let go. In the darkness, the stillness was broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the steady ticking of a wristwatch covered in condensation. Then came the faint vibration beneath the earth, so subtle that only those trained to listen for it could tell the difference between natural tremor and man-made movement. A train was approaching. It carried not only supplies and soldiers of Imperial Japan, but the illusion of control stretched across Burma like taut wire. And in the shadows, American OSS agents lay waiting, their breath shallow, their hearts drumming with the knowledge that this night would mark a fracture in the Empire's armor. What unfolded was more than sabotage. It was a collision between secrecy and power, where the jungle itself became the stage for one of the most audacious covert strikes of the war. War is often remembered through vast battles, city ruins, and names engraved into monuments. Yet the true spine of conflict is often found in smaller acts, in missions whispered about but rarely detailed, where survival hinged on silence and courage took the shape of dynamite buried beneath steel tracks. Before we step deeper into this story, if you feel the weight of history pressing in and want more of these hidden narratives revealed, I invite you to join us, subscribe, share this journey, and let the echoes of the past continue to find a voice here. Now, let us chart the arc of our story. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, the kind that clings to memory long after the body escapes it. Burma's jungles in 1943 were not landscapes meant for men. They were living labyrinths of vines and rot, where the soil itself seemed to resist every footstep. For the handful of OSS operatives dispatched to this forgotten edge of the war, the mission began with silence. No banners, no ceremony, only the oppressive weight of a land that devoured intruders and a whisper of orders that could not be repeated aloud. Their names were filed away in documents that would never see public eyes. And as they crossed from the relative safety of Allied positions into the green void, they knew their survival depended on becoming shadows within the foliage. At first, the jungle was a constant assault. Leeches slipped beneath socks, fever clung to every pore, and the chorus of unseen insects droned like a cruel metronome against their patience. The men carried more than rifles and explosives. They carried the burden of uncertainty, the knowledge that at any moment a patrol of Japanese soldiers could emerge from the undergrowth. Rifles ready, suspicion sharpened by months of guerrilla disruption. Yet there was also an intimacy in this ordeal, a forced kinship with the land. They learned to step in rhythm with the sounds around them, to let their breathing match the jungle's exhalations, to read trails not marked on any map, but etched into the habits of villagers who passed silently under bamboo canopies. Nightfall transformed the forest into something closer to a dream than reality. The moon filtered through torn clouds, its pale light fractured by the vast umbrellas of teak trees, and the operatives moved with deliberate care. Campfires were forbidden luxuries. Light meant discovery, and discovery meant death. So they lay awake in darkness, listening to the distant crack of branches, trying to decipher whether it was the tread of animals or the stealth of enemy scouts. The weight of their mission pressed hardest in these hours, when imagination blurred into paranoia, and the idea of a train rolling far beyond the tree line seemed almost unreal against the immediacy of damp earth and growling stomachs. Yet it was precisely in these nights that trust was forged. The OSS was a patchwork of backgrounds, men who had once been professors, farmers, mechanics, translators, now united by the peculiar alchemy of war. They whispered in low voices about home, about women whose letters would never reach them here, about the strange irony of risking life for rails and engines thousands of miles from the streets they had grown up on. And in that whispering, they reminded themselves that their presence in this hell was not meaningless. Every blister, every fevered night, every insect bite was an invisible thread in the tapestry of resistance that stretched across continents. As the days grew into weeks, their bodies changed with the jungle. Muscles ached into endurance, hunger shifted into a constant dullness, and fear evolved into a steady awareness, no longer a spike, but a background hum. The agents began to read the world differently. A bent stalk of grass revealed a path. A silence among the cicadas warned of larger movement, and the sudden chatter of villagers across a clearing spoke of loyalties still uncertain. For in Burma, allegiance was a fragile, shifting thing. Some villagers quietly resented the Japanese presence and offered rice or whispers of troop movements. Others, whether out of fear or opportunism, betrayed Allied agents without hesitation. Every human face was a question, every offered smile a potential death sentence. The men carried their explosives in canvas packs, each pound of dynamite a reminder of the destructive promise they had come to deliver. But dynamite alone was not enough. Timing was the true weapon, and so they waited, buried in foliage, watching the rails from afar, counting the intervals of trains, studying the guards who rode atop them, learning the heartbeat of the enemy's lifeline. The jungle became their cloak, but it was also their prison, for each day without action gnawed at resolve, turning mission into ordeal. Still, they pressed forward, the image of steel tracks shimmering in their minds, the rhythm of the locomotive's thunder haunting their half-sleep like prophecy. By the end of that first month, they had ceased to be foreigners. They were creatures of the jungle, marked by its damp touch, hardened by its cruelty, alert to its every tremor. Yet the true test had not yet arrived. For in war, preparation is both salvation and torment. And the longer they lived within the green walls of Burma, the more they wondered whether the train they stalked would ever appear. Whether their courage would find release in fire or dissolve into the silence of unrecorded sacrifice. The night before the first attempt, rain fell in sheets so dense it seemed the sky itself had collapsed. The men crouched beneath a rough canvas, water dripping steadily onto their rifles. No one spoke. In the distance, faint but growing, came the sound of an engine grinding against wet steel. Their eyes met in the half-light, and without words they knew the jungle's grip had prepared them for this moment, but it would not hold them forever. The railway was no mere convenience. It was a vein carved through hostile land, a living artery that kept the Japanese war machine in Burma supplied with men, weapons, and food. To the OSS agents crouched in the shadows, it was a line drawn across the earth that declared both opportunity and danger. Every train that clattered along those steel tracks carried the weight of an empire's ambitions, and to sever it, even for a single night, was to remind Tokyo that its reach was not infinite. The men studied the line as though it was scripture. By day, they dared only brief glimpses, retreating into foliage before patrols could catch sight of them. By night, they crept close enough to feel the hum of the rails beneath their palms, pressing ears to cold steel to catch the distant thrum of approaching locomotives. They sketched crude notes in the dirt, mapping schedules, estimating cargo, watching how often guards rode along the freight cars. The trains became like living beasts to them, predictable yet dangerous, their rhythm both hypnotic and nerve-shattering. Yet the rail was more than a military target. It was a contested lifeline for villagers whose survival depended on the unpredictable balance between occupier and occupied. The agents witnessed peasants stepping aside as Japanese convoys passed, their eyes lowered, faces unreadable. At night, when lamps were shuttered, whispers passed that rice was seized, that labor was taken, that resistance was punished swiftly. For the agents, every observation carved the stakes deeper. This was not only about steel and dynamite, but about the morale of people who lived in the shadow of the tracks. A single, successful strike could echo beyond strategy, seeding hope where fear had taken root. Patience, however, was the cruelest demand. Days bled into weeks as the men lay in damp undergrowth, their nerves stretched taut. Each passing train tightened the knot of anticipation. One man confessed quietly that the waiting was worse than battle. At least in battle the body had motion, the mind had focus. Here in the swampy air they had only the restless silence between distant rumbles. The temptation to act too soon, to detonate before timing was perfect, lingered like a devil's whisper. But sabotage was not a stage for rashness. It demanded choreography, precision, a strike so sudden and decisive that escape was still possible before the enemy's grip closed. The rail itself betrayed moods, as though the land conspired with or against them. After rainstorms, the tracks gleamed silver in the moonlight, a dangerous beacon against the dark. On dry nights, the steel was muted, easier to vanish into shadow. The men debated whether to strike at bridges or bends, weighing the promise of destruction against the likelihood of swift pursuit. Every choice felt like a wager, not only with their own lives, but with the faith of those who had sent them here. The jungle was merciless, but the rail was unforgiving in its own way. There would be no second chances if they misjudged the moment. Then there was the sound. The deep growl of engines became a constant companion, echoing long after the trains had passed. Even in uneasy dreams, the men heard the clatter of wheels, the metallic shriek of brakes, the whistle that cut through the night like a blade. Sometimes they awoke reaching for rifles, hearts pounding, only to find silence pressing down. They had begun to live in the rhythm of the rail itself, their very pulses syncing with its mechanical cadence, as though their own survival was chained to the momentum of Japanese steel. And yet, beyond the precision and the waiting, there was a strange intimacy in watching the line. It revealed the Empire's vulnerability. The great war machine that had swept across Asia, toppling cities and armies, still relied on narrow rails twisting through jungle valleys. For all its might, Japan's conquest here was fragile, dependent on tracks that could be silenced with a few well-placed charges. This knowledge was both intoxicating and terrifying. It meant the agents had the power to wound something vast, but it also meant the enemy would guard it with a ferocity born of desperation. As the agents prepared their first plan, they moved like ghosts along the embankment, their fingers brushing the iron, their eyes tracing the line into the distance where darkness swallowed it whole. Somewhere out there another train was coming, carrying fuel, weapons, or soldiers who believed themselves safe. The men exchanged glances in the moonlight, and though no words passed between them, the truth was clear. The pulse of the rail was steady, but soon it would falter. The moment of waiting broke not with ceremony, but with the low growl of an engine cutting through the jungle's humid silence. The agents crouched low, breath shallow, their bodies pressed into the earth as the first glimmer of headlamps pierced the trees. The locomotive emerged like a beast from myth, smoke curling upward, sparks leaping from its stack, wheels grinding against the rails with a rhythm that rattled the bones. It carried wagons heavy with cargo, munitions, fuel, and soldiers whose laughter drifted faintly across the night. They did not know that death waited beneath their very wheels. The charges had been laid hours earlier, each stick of dynamite secured with trembling precision, fuses checked and rechecked until the men could have lit them blindfolded. The plan demanded calm, yet calm was impossible. Hearts hammered in their chests, every instinct screaming to move, to flee, even as discipline chained them to the shadows. When the front of the train reached the marked spot, a single hand signal passed between them. A spark flared, small, fragile, swallowed almost instantly by the night. Then came silence, one heartbeat too, and then the earth convulsed. The explosion tore through the stillness like thunder from beneath the ground. Steel rails buckled, shrapnel spun through the air, and the locomotive's scream was drowned in a cacophony of twisted metal and erupting fire. The first car lurched sideways, momentum hurling it off the embankment, its bulk crushing trees as it fell. Another wagon crumpled against it, flames igniting fuel barrels that burst with deafening roars. Soldiers leapt from the cars, some consumed instantly in the blaze, others scrambling for cover, their shouts echoing through the chaos. The jungle itself seemed to recoil, birds scattering in a frenzy, animals crashing blindly through the undergrowth. For the agents, there was no time to marvel at destruction. The moment the fuses had been lit, the clock had begun. They moved quickly, retreating into the foliage, their bodies low, rifles clutched tight. The fire behind them cast long shadows, illuminating faces twisted in confusion and rage. Searchlights from surviving cars swung wildly, piercing the jungle in frantic sweeps. Bullets cracked against the trees, blind volleys fired into darkness, each shot reminding the men that their mission was not yet survival. It was escape. The air thickened with smoke, acrid and suffocating, clinging to their throats as they crawled deeper into the green abyss. One man stumbled, his boot catching on a root, and for a moment he lay exposed in a shaft of firelight. A comrade pulled him down just as a burst of gunfire ripped the leaves above them. They pressed forward, every movement a negotiation between silence and speed. Behind them, the train continued to burn, each explosion of fuel sending a fresh tremor through the night, each scream of the wounded a reminder of the chaos they had unleashed. They did not look back. To look back was to hesitate, and hesitation meant death. Yet the sounds followed them. The roar of fire, the desperate cries of men, the futile commands of officers trying to impose order on disaster. The agents pushed through thickets, their bodies scratched and bleeding, the jungle swallowing them whole once more. Still, they knew pursuit would come. The Japanese would comb the rails, would send patrols into the forest, would hunt with the relentlessness of men who could not afford to show weakness. The agents' triumph was undeniable, but it had set into motion a chase that could not be easily outrun. When at last they paused, miles from the wreckage, the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. Not the heavy, watchful quiet of waiting, but the ragged hush of men who had seen destruction bloom beneath their hands. They exchanged glances in the dim light of the moon filtering through the canopy, and though none spoke, the truth lay written across their faces. They had struck a wound into the Empire's flesh. They had lived to see the fire. But survival was not yet certain, and the jungle, impartial and unforgiving, offered no sanctuary beyond its endless shadows. Somewhere behind them, the rail still smoldered. Flames curled upward into the night sky, a signal that could not be hidden, a beacon of defiance seen for miles. The mission had been accomplished, yet its aftermath was just beginning, and the men knew that every echo of that explosion would ripple outward, drawing eyes and consequences far greater than the jungle could contain. The fire on the railway did not vanish with the dawn. Even after the last wagon was reduced to twisted ash and the embers had sunk into the earth, the scars of the explosion lingered like a wound carved into the Empire's skin. Word traveled fast in wartime Burma. Villagers whispered of the night sky lit up like day, of the thunder that had rolled through valleys, of soldiers stumbling back into towns blackened with soot and rage. For the OSS agents who had disappeared once more into the jungle, the true battle had shifted. The blast had been brief, but its reverberations carried far beyond the rails, reaching the tables of generals and the corridors of command posts. At Japanese headquarters, disbelief quickly curdled into fury. The railway had been a symbol of control, a tangible proof of power stretching deep into occupied territory. Now it was revealed as vulnerable, its aura of invincibility shattered by unseen hands. Reports from the wreckage told of scorched supplies, destroyed weapons, and soldiers burned alive in the wreck. The numbers were less important than the symbolism. If saboteurs could reach the Empire's arteries, then no garrison, no convoy, no officer could claim complete safety. Security tightened overnight. Patrols multiplied. Checkpoints sprouted along the rail line. Villagers were interrogated, and the jungle itself was treated with suspicion, as though the trees concealed an entire invisible army. For the agents, this was both victory and burden. Their strike had proved devastating, but its consequences followed them relentlessly. Japanese patrols now pushed deeper into the jungle, sweeping with dogs and machetes, torching huts suspected of harboring resistance. Villagers who had once offered quiet support grew fearful, some turning away, others betraying whispers of the saboteurs' movements. The agents moved more cautiously than ever, their survival balanced on the razor's edge between invisibility and exposure. Each day became a cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and the knowledge that their presence had made life more dangerous for those they hoped to aid. Yet beyond the jungles, in Allied command posts scattered across India and China, the sabotage carried a different weight. Intelligence officers studied the reports with satisfaction, noting the disruption to supply lines, the delays in Japanese troop movements, the unease spreading among occupying forces. A single blast had forced the Empire to redirect resources, to spend time and energy repairing tracks, replacing engines, and reinforcing security. In the cold calculus of war, the destruction of one train equaled weeks of logistical strain. The agents had not merely broken steel, they had shaken strategy, but perhaps the greatest ripple was invisible, carried not in timetables or troop counts, but in the minds of those who heard of it. For the villagers, news of the explosion traveled on the lips of traders and travelers, whispered like forbidden prayer. The Empire, so vast and unyielding, had been struck down by a handful of men hidden in the green abyss. For every act of cruelty inflicted by Japanese garrisons, there now lived the counter-memory of fire in the night. It was not victory, not yet, but it was hope. A fragile, dangerous hope that whispered that occupation was not forever. The Japanese, of course, understood the danger of that hope. Retaliation was swift, brutal, and often indiscriminate. Suspected villages were razed. Men were dragged away in the name of loyalty checks, and warnings were etched into the land with fire and bayonet. In war, the line between enemy and civilian blurred into cruelty, and the OSS agents bore the hidden guilt of knowing that their actions, though righteous, had drawn blood from innocents as well. Yet they could not stop. To hesitate now was to surrender the very principle for which they fought. That tyranny could be challenged. Even in the darkest corners of the earth, the jungle continued to close around them, thick with the smell of smoke carried on shifting winds. Each step forward was both retreat and advance, for they could never return to the site of their triumph, yet their very survival meant that the legend of Sabotage lived on. The agents moved deeper, guided not by maps but by instinct, their mission complete yet unfinished, their victory undeniable yet costly. The ripples of their strike would not cease. They would spread outward, across rivers and valleys, into the hearts of both oppressor and oppressed. And though the Empire would rebuild its rail, though engines would thunder once more across Burma, the memory of fire in the dark had already begun to erode the illusion of permanence. In the war's vast machinery, the act was small, a pinprick compared to the sprawling campaigns across Europe and the Pacific. But within its context, it was immense. It proved that empire was not invulnerable, that its power could be undermined not by armies alone, but by shadows, whispers, and dynamite smuggled through the night. The OSS had delivered more than sabotage. They had delivered a message, and messages once released into the world cannot be contained. The jungle did not remember names. It swallowed them whole, leaving behind only echoes of footsteps, fragments of rusted metal, and scars in the soil where fire once bloomed. The OSS agents, who had vanished back into its shadows, carried no banners and wrote no declarations. Their legacy was measured not in medals or parades, but in the ripples of an act few would ever know by name. Yet history itself seemed to lean toward them, as though the silence of their anonymity held a weight equal to the grand offensives that filled textbooks. They became ghosts long before their time, men whose triumphs were destined to dissolve into rumor, their very existence denied for the sake of secrecy. And yet, within that secrecy, possibilities flickered. What if the mission had failed? What if the train had passed unscathed, the dynamite discovered, the men dragged before firing squads in some forgotten clearing? Would the war have shifted in their absence, or would it have pressed on unchanged, the great machine grinding forward as though they had never lived? Speculation is the historian's temptation, but even as hypotheticals spin, when truth remains unshaken. For a moment in 1943, the Empire's grip loosened, and it was loosened not by divisions of soldiers, but by a handful of men who believed that shadow could wound Colossus. The war would not end in Burma. Its decisive blows would fall elsewhere, at Midway, in the skies above Tokyo, on the beaches of Normandy, in the frozen streets of Stalingrad, and beneath the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet even in those cataclysmic chapters, the unseen threads of sabotage, espionage, and resistance wove themselves into the larger fabric. The Manhattan Project may have ended the Pacific War, but the knowledge that Japanese supply lines could be bled in jungles thousands of miles away chipped away at the Empire's will long before surrender. Every disrupted convoy, every derailed train, every whisper of sabotage eroded morale in ways that artillery could not. When the war finally ended, the OSS itself dissolved, giving way to new agencies, new names, new missions. The men who had crawled through Burma's undergrowth returned, if they returned at all, to quiet lives. Some taught in schools, some worked in factories, some never again spoke of what they had seen. Their stories remained buried, locked behind classified files, their ghosts drifting through history without recognition. And yet the consequences of their actions remained, woven invisibly into the outcomes of campaigns and the survival of countless others. For war is not made solely by the famous battles that headline textbooks. It is shaped equally by the invisible strokes, the ones no one was meant to see, the ones carried out in silence and darkness. Perhaps that is the cruel irony of clandestine work. To succeed is to vanish. To alter history is to disappear from its pages, leaving only faint impressions for others to discover decades later. The train in Burma was destroyed, but no monument marks the place. No plaque names the men who risked everything in that single night. What endures instead is the philosophy of their act, that courage is not always loud, that defiance sometimes moves quietly through jungles, striking unseen, leaving behind nothing but questions and consequences. In this way, the OSS mission in Burma lingers not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a meditation on power and fragility. Empires, for all their grandeur, remain vulnerable to shadows. Machines, for all their strength, can be undone by whispers. And men, for all their anonymity, can shape futures they will never live to see. The fire on the railway burned only for a night, but its light illuminated a truth that stretches across every age, that even in the darkest moments, resistance carries its own kind of permanence, etched not in stone, but in memory, so the story fades back into silence, just as it began. The jungle returns to its endless hum, cicadas buzzing, leaves dripping in the aftermath of rain. Somewhere, deep within the undergrowth, rusting fragments of rail still lie hidden, relics of a night when the Empire's certainty cracked. The men who caused it remain nameless to most, but their ghosts walk with us still, reminding us that history is not only written by victors, it is written also by shadows who dared to strike and then vanish into the night.